All right, for lesson 8-14, we're going to be talking about quadrilaterals. Quadrilaterals are flat shapes. Now, if you know quad, the word quad means four, and laterals basically means sides. So we're talking about a four-sided shape with straight lines. So obviously it has four straight lines. And the straight lines are important. They're not curvy or anything like that. So different types of quadrilaterals that you know. Some of them you may be very familiar with these kinds of quadrilaterals, and some of them you may never have heard of, or you've heard of it, but you're not sure what they really are. So let's see, we've got parallelograms. Parallelograms. We have got rectangles. We've got squares. We've got rhombuses. And we have trapezoids. These are the ones we're going to focus on today. Okay, so let's talk about what each one of these is. So a parallelogram, it's a long one to write out, but a parallelogram has opposite sides are parallel, and that means that they run next to each other, but they never get closer and they never get further apart. So they look like this. I always think of like train tracks. So that's two parallel lines. This is not two parallel lines because eventually this line is going to cross over that line. So this is no, this is yes. Opposite sides are parallel. Opposite sides are congruent. Congruent. What that means is that they're equal to each other. So if one side is 5, then the side opposite of it is also 5. And the opposite angles are congruent. So again, the opposite angles are equal to each other. So congruent is like another word for equal. So a parallelogram might look like this. So the opposite side, so this is one side, this is the opposite side, is parallel. This is one side, the opposite side is also parallel. They keep going. And they would never touch. Opposite sides are congruent. So if this one is 10 centimeters, then this one is 10 centimeters. If this one is 6 meters, then this one is 6 meters. Opposite angles are congruent. That means this angle right here is the same as that angle. And that means this angle right here is the same as this angle right there. So that's what a parallelogram could look like. Okay. A rectangle. Now a lot of you are a lot more familiar with a rectangle. A rectangle is actually a parallelogram. It just happens to be a special parallelogram. So opposite sides are parallel, just like the parallelogram. Are parallel. Opposite sides are congruent. Are congruent, so they're equal, just like in the parallelogram. And the next one about the angles is a little bit different. It has 4 right angles. So what that means is that the angles are exactly 90 degrees. So they're going to look like the corner of a piece of paper. And sometimes we put a little square in there to show that it is exactly 90 degrees. That's a right angle. So this one up here cannot be a rectangle because these corners, none of those four corners are right angles. And that's why a rectangle looks like this. It has to have the four right angles. It also has the opposite sides parallel and the opposite sides congruent. So that's the rectangle. Let's talk about the square next. So the square, all right. So again, opposite sides are parallel. Are parallel. It has four right angles. And the thing that makes a square special is that all four sides are congruent. So they all equal the same. Which you probably already know that, you just haven't necessarily thought about it with the word congruent. So a square, if I draw a square, and we'll just pretend I'm drawing a really decent square. So opposite sides are parallel. It has four right angles. And all sides are congruent. So if this is 6 feet, then this also has to be 6 feet. This has to be 6 feet. And this has to be 6 feet. Now, a square is also a parallelogram because it meets all the needs of a parallelogram, and it's also a rectangle because it just happens to be a very special rectangle or a very special parallelogram. All right, let's look at a different one. Let's look at a rhombus. All right, a rhombus. So it starts off the same. Opposite sides are parallel. Okay, and all sides are congruent. But what do you notice is missing in here? It sounds a lot like the square, but what makes it different than the square? And if you said, well, it's because it doesn't have four right angles, then you're right. So it's like if you took a square and you squished it. So it kind of looks like it looks like a parallelogram because it is, but it happens to be all the sides. So again, if we took that 6-foot one up here and we just squished it to the side, but you'll notice the difference is that the angles are not right angles. Okay. And then let's talk about a trapezoid. A trapezoid has one pair of parallel sides. So this is the one that's a little bit different. Now it's still four sides, but it might look like this. So these two are parallel to each other, but look at these two are not parallel to each other. They would eventually run into each other if we kept extending them. So they're not parallel to each other, but the top and the bottom are parallel. It could also look like the sides could be parallel, and it might look something like this. And that's also a trapezoid. This side is parallel to this side, but this and this are not parallel to each other. Okay. The other word you're going to see is symmetry. And symmetry just means that if you have a shape that you could cut it in half, and this side would be exactly the same as that side. So could you cut a trapezoid in half? This one you couldn't because this side of this dotted line here does not look the same as this side. So be careful with some of these and whether you can cut those in half or not. So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. What I like to do is cut out a shape out of a piece of paper and fold it in half and see if it actually does work. All right, on your homework tonight, we will be doing pages 183. So on this one, circle all the names that describe the shape. So is that a quadrilateral? Is it a parallelogram? Is it a rectangle? Is it a trapezoid, rhombus, square? And you can circle more than one thing. In fact, a lot of these you'll be circling many things. And then sketch a shape that fits the description if possible. Some of these are not possible to do, so be careful. Read it through it carefully. Look at your notes carefully, or my notes. It's a good idea to write down those notes so you can look back at those. On page 184, we have some review of subtracting fractions. Remember, you have to find, and adding fractions, you have to find common denominators. 3/5 plus 1/4 does not equal 4/8. You cannot add 5 plus 4. You have to find a common denominator like 20. Here's some composite solid shapes. Cut them up. Like this one already looks like they said, hey, let's cut it here. And then a stretch your thinking problem. Okay, so pages 183 and 184 all.